Greeting everyone, this is Dalen Traore, and my encore presentation is about the rational addiction to alcohol by Baltagi and James Griffin. Without getting in depth, the authors started by explaining the empirical application of the rational addiction theory, which was developed by Baker and Murphy. It was explained in the article that individual, or should I say consumer, behave rationally in the way that they anticipate the expected future consequence of their current actions. The authors went to explain in the article that consumers recognize the addictive nature of their choices, but they may elect to make them because the gain from the activity exceed the cost to future addiction. According to Baker and Murphy, consumers rationally trade off these factors to determine the appropriate level of consumption. In short, they say a key feature of this theory is that consumption of an addictive good will depend on future as well as past consumption. This theory or model is rejected by the myopic model of rational addiction. Indeed, according to the myopic model of rational addiction, only past consumption stimulates current consumptions. Since the author of this article didn't provide an in-depth analysis of the model I've talked about, I thought it would be a good idea to give you guys a little background about both the rational model of addiction and the myopic model of addiction. Moving forward, I think you understand why I'm doing that. So I am starting with this rational model of addiction. Um, in the 1988 paper, Baker and Murphy developed the model of addictive behavior, and it is important to know that this addictive behavior was still subject of numerous and many economic models. Um, Gary Baker, Michael Grossman, and Kevin Murphy, they are all known as the father of economic. Um, they tested empirically the theory of rational addiction and published some well-known papers about this theory. The first paper, which was a pretty big deal, known as Baker et al., pertained to cigarette addiction, and they also had the second paper, but the third paper also was pretty known, uh, known as Grossman et al., published in 1995, dealt with alcohol addiction and prices. Basically, the main contribution of the model of rational addiction is to indicate that it is incorrect to assume the addictive goods are not sensitive to prices. Still in the same context, Baker and Murphy assume that consumers maximize a lifetime utility function, which is separable over time, and the quantity demanded on the addictive good is inversely related to the current, past, and future price of the good. They want to explain that past prices affect past consumption of the addictive good, and an increase in past consumption raises current consumption. On the other hand, a decrease in future prices lower the shadow price of current consumption, raising the current consumption. In other words, increase in past or future consumption cause current consumption to rise. Now that we have an idea on what the rational addiction model is, let's talk about the myopic model of addiction, also known as imperfectly rational behavior. This addictive behavior came from Alfred Marshall, and most economists have studied this behavior since Marshall. They came up with the idea that there are two types of models that can be classified under this topic. One type of model deals with consumers who ignore the effect of current consumption or future utility when they determine the optimal quantity of an addictive good in the current period. So in this type of model, past consumption affect current consumption through an accumulated stock of habit. In the other type of model, consumers have stable but inconsistent short-run and long-run preferences. In other words, individual preferences are not consistent over the life cycle. Now, let's go back to our article. So in the article, Baltagi listed several research projecting the myopic model of addictive behavior. The first one is Baker et al., which I talked about earlier. Again, this study pertained to cigarette consumption. So for this study, they used annual per capita sale data for the US states over the period of 1955 to 1985. The study rejected the myopic model of addictive behavior. Another study Baltagi talked about in this article is the one of economist Chalupka, which took place from 1976 to 1980. This study used microdata on cigarette consumption from the National Health and Nutrition Examination Survey. The study also rejected the myopic model of addiction and supported the rational model of addiction. The third study that Baltagi and Griffin talked about in this article was the one of Bartley and Olik Oliken. Once again, the study supported the rational addiction theory. The last study, which I also talked about in this in the previous slide, is another study of Murphy, Baker, and Grossman, which pertained to alcohol consumption among high school seniors. Once again, the study supported the rational addiction theory and rejected the myopic model. So in summary, we can see that many important studies support the rational addiction theory. Trying to contribute to the topic of economic in general, Baltagi and Griffin also conducted a study and they used annual per capita distilled spirit consumption for 42 states over 36 years from 1959 to 1994. They wanted to know whether their results will support the rational addiction hypothesis for liquor. Support it or not support it? You will know that in the next slide. For the study, or should I say the empirical implementation, the authors created an empirical equation that you can see here. This equation will help them later determine whether the rational addiction theory is once again supported. So in the equation, the subscript I represents the states, like you can see 1 to 42. T represent the years, here 1 to 36. CIT is the per capita consumption of liquor. PIT is the average retail price of the addictive good they are studying. Um, YIT is the real per capita disposable income. PNIT denotes the minimum real price of liquor in any neighboring state. And the last one, UIT, allows for possible border purchasing effects. Still in the same context, the researcher considered both state variable and time invariant variable, which according to them are crucial when conducting a longitudinal study. In terms of time invariant variable, also referred as time dummies, the author included those time dummies to control for government intervention, such as Traffic Safety Act of 1983, the Federal Uniform Act of 1984, the introduction of a warning label on all alcohol beverage. So basically, these policy can change individual addictive behavior, which can change the result of the study. So that's why they took those in consideration. So in terms of state variable, also referred as state dummies, they explain that state dummies are included to control state specific characteristics. So for example, the author talked about some states like Montana, Arizona, New Mexico, Florida, Texas, um, either allowed the sale of tax exempted liquor or they were tax exempted military base. So in those states, the per capita consumption was high and compared to other states, which also can change the result of the study. So they needed to take that in consideration as well. So the author had some interesting findings when conducting this study, and I thought it would be good to talk about those findings because they are pertinent to the whole purpose of this presentation. So they found that adult per capita liquor consumption dropped significantly between 1974 and 1992 from 3.5 gallon per head in 1974 to 1.97 gallon per head in 1992. So one would ask what really changed. And from my understanding, when I was reading this article, um, the author mentioned that excise tax for distilled spirit was the same between 1951 to 1985, and the price of that liquor was 10.50. Then in 1985, the liquor saw an increase of 19% to reach 12.50. So you can see that it went from 10.50 to 12.50. And again, the liquor saw another increase in 1991 by 8% to reach 13.50. So now we went from 10.50 to 13.50. So my simple deduction is that when the price of liquor increased, a significant decrease of adult per capita liquor consumption was noted. Really quick, what I just talked about in the previous slide can be seen here throughout these different figures. So we can see that whenever there was a high tax, the per capita consumption per head of distilled spirit drops significantly from states like California, Florida, New York, Maryland. Now, let's get into the serious part of Baltagi and Griffin's study. So this part was a little bit complicated to interpret as there were a lot of SPSS terms used in it. And if I remember correctly, Mrs. Sadaf asked that we don't get in depth with those SPSS terms. So I try to simplify this part as possible, and I will ask that you focus more on the results rather than the interpretation itself. So the author did what is called a heterogeneous and homogeneous rational addiction model estimate. And from the equation shown here, uh, for the heterogeneous rational addiction model part, they allowed the coefficient of the equation above to vary both from state to state and from year to year. So from that equation that is shown here, they obtain an heterogeneous second equation across all states. From this heterogeneous second equation, they conducted a time series regression, and a cross section estimate. The results supported the rational model of addiction and rejected the myopic model of addiction. For the homogeneous rational addiction model estimate, the author, with this equation shown here, they assumed that the coefficient of the equation do not vary over time and state, and the result also supported the rational model of addiction and rejected the myopic model of addiction. So in short, like in summary, using both the heterogeneous and homogeneous rational addiction estimate, um, the empirical evidence was in favor of the rational addiction model rather than the myopic model of addiction. In conclusion, the author throughout the study demonstrated that price elasticity is a key component of the rational addiction theory. For them, since the consumption of a good is negatively related to its price, a price reduction in the future, perhaps because of an expected tax break, will increase future consumptions, which in turn will increase the current marginal utility of that good, hence its consumption. Same as Baker and Murphy, Baltagi and Griffin supported the idea that rational addict consumers are sensitive to price change, which means that individuals tend to reduce their consumption of addictive substances as they anticipate the future cost of these substances increase. Um, they think that tax are an effective weapon as a social control device to reduce consumption of alcohol and even cigarette in the long run. So for them, if, for example, the addict are rational, a tax hike of an addictive good will decrease their future consumption. Um, I personally think that heavy drinkers are not always sensitive to price change, and that is another problem. Throughout this presentation, we learned about the rational addiction model, which states that consumption of an addictive good will depend on future as well as past consumption. I personally agree with this rational addiction model. Like Batagi and Griffin, I truly believe that tax is an effective weapon to reduce present and future alcohol consumption. Based on the research, I think a higher alcohol tax will reduce excessive drinking, and alcohol tax consumption is responsive to price, and the impact of the potential tax increase is likely to be proportional to its size. In terms of economic impact, I think alcohol has direct and indirect costs, and I try to illustrate that with this picture right here, where in terms of indirect costs, there's a loss of productivity, pain, and suffering. Um, Alcohol tax policy, I think, can reduce the quantity of and frequency of youth drinking. Nobody really knows why the prevalence of excessive drinking is still high in the US, but I think um, it is because of producers, industry opposition. Uh, I have the feeling that the industry knows that increased tax means increased prices, which mean uh, lower sale of alcohol. So here's my question to you guys. As we all know, alcohol consumption can have adverse social and economic effect on the individual drinker, the drinker's immediate environment, and society as a whole. A large body of public health research supporting the rational addiction model, found that tax increases are one of the most effective and well-researched ways of reducing alcohol problems. More importantly, data from the CDC revealed that more than 88,000 people die from alcohol-related death each year in the US, and alcohol continues to be one of the nation's most preventable causes of death. I believe alcohol industries and their lobby lawmakers stand in the way of a higher alcohol tax, as they are warning that such initiatives will lead to fewer jobs, which could eventually impact our economy. I truly believe that is why our government is currently failing to effectively implement tax policy interventions. So my question to you is, what is your take on this issue? Excessive drinking, as we know, is draining the US. So in your opinion, what can be done to address this problem? Um, I really hope you enjoyed this presentation. I know it was at time confusing, but um, I hope I was able to explain the whole issue of rational addiction theory to you clearly. And thank you so much for taking your time to sit down and listening to me. Thank you.